8 faces carried the High Chaparral across 4 seasons in the Arizona desert. A Golden Globe winner died alone in her sleep. Only one is still alive in 2026. The rest were scattered across cemeteries, given back to families, and poured into the Pacific. This is what happened to each of them, and where they rest. We begin our countdown with a man who wrote hundreds of letters and received almost nothing back. Cameron Mitchell grew up one of 7 children of a Pennsylvania minister, wearing his sister's hand-me-down shoes through the Depression, and a high school teacher had to lend him the money just to reach a New York drama school. Once there, he wrote to every producer, agent, and star whose name he could find, and the silence was total until he criticized a film performance by Alfred Lunt, and Lunt of all people wrote back inviting him to audition. The actor's wife, Lynn Fontanne, told the young man that acting was his life's work and changed his surname to Mitchell, and a career was born out of a single reply. On the show, he was Buck Cannon, the hard-drinking, big-hearted younger brother of Big John, full of warmth and laughter. Behind that comic ease was a working actor who never stopped moving. A Theatre World Award had come his way in 1949 for that salesman role, and years later the whole High Chaparral cast would share a German Bambi Award. By the 1970s and 1980s, the parts had changed into spaghetti westerns, the Mario Bava thrillers, and a long stretch of horror and exploitation pictures like The Toolbox Murders. One of them later mocked on Mystery Science Theater 3000, and he took all of it. More than 300 credits across 50 years, because the work itself was the point. His one long marriage was to Johanna Mendel, daughter of a Canadian meatpacking tycoon, and it lasted 20 years before ending in 1960. Their son Robert arrived on the 4th of July in 1941. 2 of their children, Camille and Cameron Jr., followed their father into acting, and another son ran the family business up in Saskatoon. Those Canadian ties stayed with him for the rest of his life. Lung cancer took Cameron Mitchell on July 6, 1994, at his home in Pacific Palisades, California, at the age of 75. He rests now at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, out in the Riverside County desert, one of only 2 people on this entire list who left a grave a fan can actually stand beside. The boy nobody would answer turned one reply into a 50-year career, and he kept his footing long after the leading men of his era had vanished from the screen. By the time the High Chaparral ended its run in 1971, the man at its center had just lost the one thing his character spent 4 seasons trying to protect. Leif Erickson's only son, William, known as Bill, died that same year in a car accident, and the actor who had spent his life playing strong, certain men carried that grief quietly for the rest of his days. To viewers, he was Big John Cannon, the iron-willed patriarch driving a cattle empire into hostile Apache country. Long before any of that, he was a Navy man in the truest sense. Born in Alameda, California, the son of a sea captain, he started out singing and playing trombone in a band before the war pulled him into the Naval Aviation Photographic Unit, where he rose to Chief Petty Officer. He shot combat film across the Pacific, was shot down twice, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and stood among the men who filmed the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The frontier toughness he brought to John Cannon was never invented in a writer's room. His private life held one of Hollywood's saddest names. From 1936 to 1942, he was married to actress Frances Farmer, whose own story would end in tragedy. And on the very day that divorce was finalized, he married actress Margaret Hayes, a union that fell apart within about a month. He found steadiness at last with Anne Diamond in 1945, they had Bill in 1946, and a daughter Susan in 1950, and they stayed together until the end. After the ranch went dark in the 1971 network purge that swept rural westerns off the air, his screen work thinned to guest spots. A 1976 stage tour of John Brown's Body with Rock Hudson and Claire Trevor, and a final appearance on Fantasy Island in 1984. He kept homes in Pensacola and Malibu, and loved nothing more than to sail. Cancer took Leif Erickson on the 29th of January 1986 at Baptist Hospital in Pensacola, Florida, at the age of 74. He had chaired Florida's American Cancer Society and had been ill for roughly a year, with Anne and Susan beside him. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered, though no public record says exactly where, a fitting silence perhaps, for a sailor's son who loved the water, even if no source will confirm the sea took him. The man who played an unbreakable father had outlived his own only child by 15 years, and the strength audiences admired on screen was the same strength it took him to keep going after. There is one name here who hid something from millions of viewers for his entire career, and his story is the one that stops a production cold. Our third name died with the cameras still rolling. In June of 1970, in the kitchen of his Pasadena home, Frank Silvera reached under the sink to fix a garbage disposal that was still connected to power, and the current, carried by the water at the basin, killed him on the spot. He was 55, alone in the house, and was found dead later that day. Because doctors had been treating him for high blood pressure, the death was first written off as a heart attack. On the ranch, he was Don Sebastian Montoya, the proud, imperious Mexican land baron at the heart of the story. What audiences watching that towering patriarch almost never realized was the truth of the man playing him. Frank Silvera was born in Kingston, Jamaica, to a black Jamaican mother and a Portuguese Jewish father, raised in Boston, and so light-skinned that across his whole career he was cast as white, Latino, Polynesian, and every shade in between, a range that earned him the nickname the Man with 1,000 Faces. He left law school the day he won his first stage role, served in the Navy in the war, and reached Broadway and the Actors Studio on pure craft. The film debut came in a 1952 Western, a general's role opposite Marlon Brando in Viva Zapata, and two early Stanley Kubrick pictures, Fear and Desire and Killer's Kiss. Silvera never hid who he was, and he fought for it in the open. The advertisements he took out in Hollywood trade papers attacked the demeaning roles handed to black performers, and in 1964 he founded the Theater of Being in Los Angeles, one of the earliest black-led theater companies, paying for it out of his own pocket. A Tony nomination came in 1963 for The Lady of the Camellias, yet his deepest mark was the door he held open for others. That work outlived him by design. In 1973, 3 years after his death, Morgan Freeman and a group of fellow artists founded the Frank Silvera Writers' Workshop to develop African-American playwrights, an institution still tied to his name half a century on. Frank Silvera rests at Long Island National Cemetery in Farmingdale, New York, buried with military honors as a Navy veteran, one of only 2 people on this list with a marked grave to visit. The viewers who watched him rule the Montoya estate never knew they were watching a Jamaican-born black activist who spent his own money fighting the very industry that kept casting him as everyone except himself. Be honest with me down in the comments. Before this video, did you have any idea that the man playing Don Sebastian was a black actor and a civil rights fighter? I would love to know how many of you knew his real story. She came from a poverty most of her co-stars could never have imagined. Linda Cristal was orphaned at 13 when both of her parents died, and the family had been so poor that, by her son's account, she had already watched a brother die for lack of money to buy his medicine. She grew up with barely a 5th-grade education, and she would still go on to speak 5 languages and, in her own telling, stow away toward a better life. To viewers, she was Victoria, the spirited Mexican bride married into the Cannon family, intelligent and essential, never decorative. Out of that beginning, she built something almost unimaginable. Discovered as a young model by a Mexican producer and pulled into Mexican and Argentine cinema, she crossed into Hollywood, took home a Golden Globe as the most promising newcomer of 1958 for The Perfect Furlough, and was asked by John Wayne himself to play Flaca in The Alamo. Her work on The High Chaparral earned 2 Emmy nominations and, in 1970, a second Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Television Drama, making her the only member of this entire cast to take home that award for the show. Love came to her in pieces. A 1950 marriage to an Argentine actor was annulled after just 5 days, and a later marriage to a businessman lasted barely a year. The one that mattered was her third, to Yale Wexler, which gave her the 2 sons, Gregory and Jordan. She built the rest of her life around, taking custody of both after the marriage ended and stepping back from fame to raise them herself. Jordan would one day help her write her memoir, A Life Unexpected. Her screen work thinned after The Ranch, with the film Mr. Majestic in 1974, a turn in the miniseries Condominium, and a final lead in the Argentine series Roce in 1985, after which she became a licensed real estate agent and ran an import and export business of her own. Linda Cristal died on the 27th of June 2020 in her sleep at her home in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 89. Her son confirmed she had quietly endured glaucoma and other ailments in her final years, and the specific cause was never made public. She was cremated, and her ashes were given to the family who had been her whole reason for stepping away. An orphan who lost her parents and a brother and arrived with nothing became the only person on this call sheet to win a Golden Globe for the show, and then chose her children over the spotlight that had finally found her. The next man grew up in a restaurant where Humphrey Bogart and Tallulah Bankhead came to drink, and he had to be twice as good as everyone around him just to be seen. He spent years being told, in effect, that good was not enough. Henry Darrow, born Enrique Delgado in Manhattan, logged dozens of small and often uncredited parts, sometimes billed under his real surname, before a single role changed everything. And he was blunt about why it had been so hard, saying that a Latino actor could not afford to be merely good. He had to be great. On the ranch, he was Manolito Montoya, Victoria's roguish, quick-witted brother and the breakout charmer of the entire series. That charm came straight out of Shakespeare. Darrow grew up partly in Bedford Village, New York, where his Puerto Rican parents ran the inn and restaurant that drew the likes of Bogart and Bankhead, then moved with the family to Puerto Rico at 13 and studied acting before winning a scholarship to the Pasadena Playhouse. He shaped Manolito deliberately, borrowing Mercutio's wit and Iago's edge, and the result made him the first Puerto Rican actor to star in a major American television series. Those first did not stop there. He took home a Daytime Emmy in 1990 for the soap Santa Barbara, the first Hispanic actor to win in his category, and in 2012, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award named for Ricardo Montalban. In 1956, he married Louise Dupuy, raised a daughter and a son before that marriage ended in 1979, and later found a lasting partnership with Lauren Darrow, who stayed beside him through the decades and through the conventions where fans finally got to meet their Manolito. Work never really left him either. He carried on for decades as Detective Manny Quinlan on Harry O, as the voice and later the elder face of Zorro across several productions, and as a guest on everything from The Golden Girls to Star Trek Voyager. The big screen handed him a darker turn too, as the vengeful trooper Hancock in the thriller The Hitcher. Henry Darrow died of natural causes on the 14th of March, 2021, at his home in Wilmington, North Carolina, at the age of 87, surrounded by his family. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea. A man who had to be twice as good just to be seen opened a door that a whole generation of Latino actors walked through after him, and then asked, at the end, to be returned to the open water. If these stories are landing the way I hope they are, take a moment to subscribe. This channel exists to make sure the people who built shows like this one are remembered by name and by the place where they rest. He arrived in Hollywood as a 14-year-old who slept on a church floor. Gilbert Roland was born Luis Antonio Damaso de Alonso in Ciudad Juarez, the son and grandson of bullfighters, and was training for the ring himself when Pancho Villa seized their town and forced the family to flee into Texas. The boy hopped a freight train to California with only a 7th-grade education to his name, took menial jobs, slept where he could, and built a screen name out of 2 performers he admired, John Gilbert and Ruth Roland. Late in the run, he stepped in as Don Domingo Montoya, the courtly grandee inheriting the family estate. By then, he had already lived a career almost no one could match. He had once been engaged to the silent star Clara Bow, made his early name as a dashing Cisco kid in the post-war years, and across 7 decades carried a weathered grace that survived the one limit the industry kept imposing on him, the Latin lover box it could never quite see him out of, even as his range deepened with age. 2 Golden Globe nominations and a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame marked the respect he earned anyway. His great romance played out in the gossip columns and then outlasted them. In 1941, he married the actress Constance Bennett, and they had 2 daughters before divorcing in 1946, with Bennett taking custody. A second marriage, to Guillermina Cantu in 1954, was the quiet one that held, lasting 40 years, all the way to the very end of his life. Gilbert Roland died of cancer on the 15th of May, 1994, at his home in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 88, having fought the disease for 2 years alongside emphysema and diabetes. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea off the California coast, the same final resting place as Henry Darrow, the 2 Montoya men of this cast given back to the same ocean. A bullfighter's son who fled a revolution and slept in a church became one of Hollywood's longest-working leading men, and the boy who came in on a freight train went out on the tide. The next man shares his bloodline with Henry Ford, and with a passenger on a ship from 1621 whose name you already know from this very show. He was erased from the series without a single word of explanation. After 3 seasons as the heart of the Cannon family, Mark Slade left the High Chaparral amid a contract dispute during studio-wide budget cuts, and the production simply wrote his character out at the start of the 4th season, never telling the audience where Billy Blue had gone. On screen, he had been exactly that heart. Blue, John's blonde, blue-eyed son, the show's most emotional thread. His story carries one of the strangest footnotes in the whole cast. Born in Salem, Massachusetts, the son of a businessman and watercolor artist, Slade traces his maternal line back to Henry Ford's family and to the 1621 ship Fortune, whose passenger manifest happens to list a man named John Cannon, the very name of the patriarch he would one day serve on television. He had enrolled at Worcester Academy meaning to become a cartoonist, caught the acting bug filling in for a sick classmate, and worked at New York's 21 Club to pay for drama school. Before the ranch, he had played a sailor on Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and turned up on Gomer Pyle. What the show took from him, he rebuilt on his own terms. Slade kept acting into the early 1990s, then returned to that first love and became a working illustrator, cartoonist, and novelist, with a comic strip called Howard and Friends, created with the man behind Barney Miller, that ran for years. International audiences had already showered his work on the show with honors, from a Belgian Viewers Award to a German Bambi and a Western Heritage Award. He has stayed married and kept his private life genuinely private, and that quiet is its own kind of answer to how he was treated. As of 2026, Mark Slade is 87 years old, living in California, and he is the only member of this cast still with us, the sole survivor of the 8 faces we opened on. Written off without a word, the young man at the center of the series outlived every co-star on this list and quietly became the artist he had set out to be long before acting ever found him. Our last name outlived every other person in this story, and you have almost certainly heard his voice selling bubblegum. He actually lived the life the rest of them only played. Before Don Collier ever sat a horse on camera, he had worked as a geologist, a logging hand, a ranch hand, and a surveyor, and had served in both the Navy and the Merchant Marine, a genuine working cowboy who fell into acting almost by accident on the strength of how he rode. His break had come in 1960 on the NBC series Outlaws, where he climbed from deputy to marshal across 2 seasons. For all 4 seasons, he was Sam Butler, the steady, honorable ranch foreman who held the bunkhouse together. This was a man who summed himself up without a trace of vanity. In a 1968 interview, he described his part as someone who punches cattle for a living, played straight, and he meant it. Yet that plainness anchored one of the busiest Western careers of his generation. He stood beside John Wayne in El Dorado, The War Wagon, and The Undefeated, recurred on The Young Riders, turned up in Tombstone, hosted the public television series The Desert Speaks, and spent years as the deep-voiced gumfighter in a run of bubblegum commercials a whole generation can still quote. Late in life, he even toured a one-man stage show called Confessions of an Acting Cowboy. His marriage was the long, steady kind the West so rarely allowed. He was wed to casting director Holly Heyer. The 2 of them raised 4 children together, and his family eventually stretched to a long line of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her death in 2012 left him to carry on alone for another 9 years. Lung cancer took Don Collier on the 13th of September, 2021, at the age of 92, in rural Kentucky, where he had moved from his longtime Tucson home, and a celebration of his life was held at a small Baptist church nearby. He was cremated, and his ashes were given to the family who survived him, the longest life by far of anyone on this list. The man who played a plain working cowboy actually was one, off camera and for real, and he rode that quiet authenticity all the way to 92. 2 graves in the desert and on Long Island ashes in the Pacific and in the hands of grieving families, and one man, in California, still here.